Hi, welcome to this video recording of typical communication changes with aging. What I wanted to cover today in this lecture is just briefly review your understanding of what communication, language and speech mean. Then look in a little bit more detail around the components of speech, and then apply that knowledge to how communication changes in typical healthy aging. Okay, so communication is a word that we all know and use in everyday language, but in speech pathology it has a specific, precise meaning, just like the word language and speech have precise meanings in speech pathology. And it's really important to be clear about what the word communication means in a speech pathology context. And basically, a communication is a process that involves being able to perceive and understand messages expressed by others, as well as being able to plan and produce our own messages. So, for example, communication is really broad, so there's many different ways we communicate with each other in a face-to-face conversation, or even actually over audio-visual like this. You're perceiving and understanding a range of different messages from me. So you'll be perceiving and understanding what you hear from the words that I'm saying, but you'd also be perceiving and understanding the visual information. And so there's different types of modalities, if you like, that you're perceiving and understanding at the same time to help you understand my message. And at the same time, once if we were in an interactive situation, I would be checking with you to see if you understood that, and I'd be looking to you to plan and produce a message to give back to me. And so that's what communication's about. It's using a range of modalities and it's interactive. You need to perceive and understand a message, but then also plan and produce your own. Okay, so language is a particular subtype of communication. So if we think about communication in any type of a modality, I could communicate with you through a facial expression. That would be very effective communication, but it wouldn't be language. Language is a particular type of communication. The key about language, what makes something a language, is that it's a socially shared code. It can be verbal or non-verbal, but it must be rule-based. And that it, once you've learned those rules, you can create an infinite number of different messages because you know the rules. So what are the rules of a language? And you would have covered these with Tanya, but so I'll go over them just briefly now so that you can be reminded of what we're talking about here. There's the rules around the phonology of a language, and that is the rules of spoken languages. Spoken languages have rules around the sounds in the language, what sounds can go together and what sounds can't. So for example, in English, the sounds b, a, t can go together to make a word. That's legal. It's a legal sound combination in English. Whereas the sounds g and t aren't a legal combination in English. We don't have words that have bitter running together. So that's one of the rules that children have to learn, is about what sounds make up the language that they're learning and how those sounds can be combined. But it's only one of the 5 rules of language. Another rule is around the morphological rules, or rules of morphology. And they're rules, if you recall from Tanya's lecture, around how components of a word can be combined. So for example, the word bird is a word on its own, and we can add another morpheme to that word, S, which is carries the meaning of plural. So then we'd have birds. So that is the morphological rules of English say that if we want to talk about more than one thing, we add a plural or a sound. The third rules of a language around syntax, and that's how words are combined in a certain order to make meaning. So in English, we have very strict, like every language, rules about how words are ordered. For example, I might say, I typed the letter. That would be completely legal in terms of the syntax of the language. It would be completely illegal and make no sense to say, type letter the I, because I've mixed the order of the words up. So that's another rule of language. Semantics are the rules around what words mean in a language. So for example, when we say the word bird, we know that we're talking about an animal that flies. That's the semantic meaning that's attached to the word bird. But of course, in different cultures and in different slang, bird can mean something else. So understanding the semantics of a language is also understanding the different nuances. It's not very common anymore, but bird used to be another word for a female. But you're probably not actually, a little bit old-fashioned now, and probably not terribly politically correct to refer to women as birds, but that is another semantic meaning of the word. So semantics is about understanding what words can mean in different contexts. Pragmatics is the final rule of language, rules around language, and that's about knowing how to use language in different contexts. So that, for example, how the kinds of words you'd use and how you'd communicate with your friends is probably very different, hopefully, from how you might communicate with someone that you haven't met before, who you're hoping will employ you for some work. So that's about knowing the rules of how to communicate formally or informally. So all languages, all spoken languages, have those 5 rules around the sound system, how words are combined, how words are ordered, the meaning of words, and how to use words. Okay. Finally, speech is a subcomponent of spoken language. It's that, as you know, a component of verbal language. It's the acoustic representation of language. There's 2 types of speech that we think about in speech pathology. Speech perception being the auditory analysis of the speech signal. So when you hear a sound, you have to perceive it as speech. And speech production, which involves the neuromusculature function to produce a speech sound. We're going to focus a little bit on the components of speech production because I'm not sure that's been covered to date in your 4 weeks. So basically this is about thinking about what neuromusculature functions are involved in producing a speech sound. So you might want to think about, say, have a go at producing a word like bar. And you might want to pause the video here and just think about what muscles are involved in producing the word bar. What's involved? Well, we need respiration. We need some lung support to power your voice. And we need phonation. We need the vocal folds coming together, adducting to produce a voice, a phonation, a voice sound. Then we need to shape the voice to make it into a speech sound. So we might do that through resonance, prosody, and articulation. So for a word like bar, in terms of articulation, the way we shape that sound is with our lips. We bring our lips together, ba, to create the b sound, and then the way we shape our tongue produces the r sound. Okay. But prosody is really important here too, because we might say bar in terms of let me think about this for a little bit. The way you use prosody can change what you mean. So, for example, if I said bar, it might be like, do you want to go to bar? Or, you know, are you going to the bar? It's a question. Whereas if someone had said to me, where's Max? I might say bar. And that's sort of the different intonation gives you a different meaning to what I'm trying to tell you. One, when I raise it, bar, is I might trying to ask a question. Whereas if bar with a sort of downward sort of prosody intonation, I'm just making a statement. Resonance is about how the sounds, your voice is shaped in the vocal tract, and hopefully Jenny was talking to you about resonance, the difference between, say, oral resonance, sounds being resonated through your oral cavity versus sounds being resonated through your nasal cavity. So when in speech pathology, what it's useful to know is when we talk about speech, we really are talking about the components of speech that contribute to the production of talk, and then talk that's intelligible. So you might hear people talk about something, how intelligible someone is, and what they mean by that is how easy their speech is to understand. When we talk about voice, we're still talking about speech, but a different kind of perspective. When we talk about voice, we're talking about respiration in terms of the power that drives voice. We're talking about the source of the voice in terms of the vocal folds at phonation. And then we're talking about resonance, prosody, and articulation as shaping the voice. So voice is a type of, we're still talking about speech, but we're just focusing our attention on the production of the sound of the voice. Similarly, when we talk about fluency, we're also talking about speech, but what we're actually referring to there is the coordination of all these different motor components to produce fluent, smooth speech. Let's sum that up for you. So in terms of range of practice areas, multimodal communication is about communication, that broad, holistic, any way of communicating a message, verbally, non-verbally, through gestures, facial expression, or through language. Anything that communicates, sends or receiving a message. whereas language is about the spoken and written languages that have rules, that are rule-based systems. And when we talk about speech, we're talking about the production or that acoustic representation of spoken language. When we talk about speech, we're actually referring to the production of talk, but we also know that voice is speech, is a type of perspective on speech, and fluency is another perspective on speech. Okay. Another way to think about this is the communication chain, and I understand that you've looked at this already. So just briefly, it's another way of thinking about it. Communication, if you look at that, is in the green. It covers everything, whereas language is just about what happens in your brain, understanding what someone means, planning your message and thinking of the words, whereas speech is about the actual motor production of speech sounds or the perception of speech sounds. Okay. So I've done that for two reasons. One, just to give you a chance to recap and consolidate some of the core concepts that you need going into first year of your GEMS, but also to think about those key concepts in relation to how they change as we grow older. And what I want to focus on is two areas in particular. One, how language changes as we get older, or our language abilities. And the other one is as perception of talk, really, focusing more on hearing. So I know you've done some hearing work, so we won't go through this in too much detail, but basically to say that you might recall that there are three parts to hearing. You've got your outer ear, which makes up the pinna and the ear canal. You've got the middle ear of the eardrum probably is part of the outer ear, and then the middle ear is the three little bones, and then the inner ear is the cochlea that attaches to a nerve. So you might recall from your previous lecture that to hear, the sound wave goes into the outer ear, it vibrates the eardrum, that sets off a series of vibrations through those small ossicles, those small ear bones in the middle ear, and that sets off vibrations in the cochlea in the inner ear. And the fluid in the cochlea moves little hair cells that are in the cochlea, and those hair cells transform that mechanical movement into an electrical impulse. That is the nerve neural detection of sound. And that's why that's why if there's any problem with hearing occurs in the outer ear or the middle ear, it's called a conductive hearing loss, because it's a problem to do with how the sound is conducted mechanically through the outer or middle ear. But if there's a problem with hearing occurring at the inner ear, it's called a sensory neural loss, because the problem is with the nerve, at the nerve endings for hearing. Why am I telling you all this? Well, it's important if we think about communication and aging, because as you would, many of you would know, hearing typically declines as we get older. In typical aging people, hearing tends to be less acute, and that's called that phenomenon is called presbycusis. Presby means age. So if you ever see the word presby, it's likely that's something to do with age or aging. So presbycusis means age-related hearing loss. There are lots of reasons why people's hearing isn't as sensitive as they get older. And the reasons are, some of them are endogenous, which means they happen within the ear, changes to the ear itself. And some of the changes or reasons for the change in hearing are exogenous, which means they've come from outside factors that are impacting on someone's hearing. So what are the endogenous factors? Well, first of all, that outer ear, the pinna and the ear canal, that can degenerate with age. The cartilage can get weaker, and so that the ear canal itself can collapse and be smaller, so that there's less space really for the sound waves to travel through. Those little in the middle ear, those three little bones, they can also there can be degenerative changes in those bones as we age, which can make them less sensitive to movement, which will also mean that the sound is not conducted as well into the inner ear. And there can also be, just with the process of aging, changes in the inner ear. There can be loss of the hair cells in the cochlea. So there are some reasons why just naturally occurring process of aging can affect the structure and the function of the ear. But there are some other external causes that can also impact on a person's hearing. Coexisting illnesses are one of them. Interestingly, a lot of people who have cardiovascular disease or heart disease also have hearing impairment. And they think it's because if you've got a heart condition, you might have reduced blood flow to the inner ear, which makes the cochlea function less well. Another reason why people who are older often have less acute hearing is because they might have been exposed to noise over their lifetime, especially people who've worked in really noisy environments, like people who work in nightclubs, musicians who are exposed to high levels of noise will often have noise-induced hearing loss. And the other reason is that the older you are, the more likely it is that you might have some other illnesses that you're taking medication for. And some medication is ototoxic, and that means that they damage their hearing mechanism. How antibiotics are actually toxic to the auditory system, I'm not aware of the details of how that actually occurs, but it's well known that there are a range of medications that are ototoxic and can affect hearing. Okay, what you might want to think about is just tying in how the ICF might relate to this conversation. And as you might recall, the ICF thinks about someone's a condition in terms of how it impacts at the body function and structure level, but then also how it might affect everyday activities, participation in everyday life situations, and the environmental factors that might help or hinder, personal factors that might also influence functioning. So if we say that the impairment is presbycusis, age-related hearing loss, you might want to think about, well, what might age-related hearing loss, what kind of impact would that have on everyday activities, like having a conversation with a friend, going out to dinner with a group of friends or family, And would it restrict any life situations, employment opportunities, volunteer opportunities, the kinds of what people might be interested in doing? And then we could also think about, well, how does the environment impact on someone's ability to hear if they've got an age-related hearing loss? And so I guess I'm thinking there about if you could imagine someone eating out with friends at a restaurant. What kind of a restaurant would make it easy for them to hear well, and what kind of circumstances in a restaurant would make it really difficult for someone to hear well? And that would give you a sense of the kinds of facilitators or barriers that might influence how well someone hears. Of course, one of the very common things that people provide or people use when they've got a hearing impairment like presbycusis, age-related hearing loss, is hearing aid. And that's another type of environmental factor that hopefully helps people with their hearing. But of course, someone's willingness to use a hearing aid would also depend on personal factors, like how they feel about wearing a hearing aid, and their willingness to learn how to wear it, and their motivation to do so. Okay, so we've looked at hearing as the beginning of perceiving speech sounds, because that's one thing that really changes significantly in healthy older people as they get older. But another thing that changes is language abilities. So let's get to look at that in a bit more detail here. It's very common for people who are perfectly healthy and no disease or illness going on to, as they get older, to report that they're having trouble thinking of people's names and retrieving the names of objects. And it's that often people will say, I know what the word is, it's on the tip of my tongue, I just can't get it. And so it's actually been called the tip of the tongue phenomenon because so many people describe it. So how could you actually measure someone's ability to retrieve words, think of words? Well, there is a couple of standard ways to measure word retrieval. Let's have a look at them. One way is to ask people to think of as many words as they can in a group. So, for example, the one test of verbal fluency or word retrieval means the same thing, is how many animals that you can name in 30 seconds. And that's what this study that I'm showing you the graph here of had a look at. So basically in this study done by Lee and colleagues in 2015, they tested the ability of people to name as many animals as they could think of in 30 seconds. And they got people who were between the age of 60 and 64 to do this. They got another group of people between 65 and 69 to do this. Another group between 70 and 74, and 75 to 79, and 80 to 84. Just going to try and... So you can see here along the bottom, these are the age groups. Okay. And here you can see the total number of animals named. Okay, so we can tell by looking at this graph that for people who are between 60 and 64, on average, they can name about 10 to 11 animals in 30 seconds. And it's pretty similar for people who are between 65 and 69 and 70 to 74. It's all sort of looking around the same number. Their verbal fluency is very similar. But interestingly, it seems to drop off pretty sharply from about 75 on, because people in that age group, again, healthy older people, were only able to recall on average about 7 animals in 30 seconds. But it stayed pretty consistent then for the older group, 80 to 84. So there does seem to be something going on that means as you get older, it's harder to think of as many words as quickly, which kind of explains why so many people who are older talk about the tip of the tongue phenomenon. But it might not just be age that's impacting this. I want you to have a look at this table. This table looked at people's verbal fluency, but they used a different measure. What they did was ask people to think of as many words as they could, starting with the letter F, and it gave them 60 seconds to do it. And then they said, and now I want you to think of as many words as you can think of that start with the letter A, and gave them another 60 seconds. And then think of as many words as you can think of starting with the letter S for 60 seconds. And then they added up the number of words that start with F, A and S to get a total number of words recalled in that time. Okay, so that's the task. How did people go? So this is a study that was done in 1999 with a group of typically healthy adults from 16 years of age and onwards. And they grouped their results in terms of people who were aged between 16 and 59 here. Then they looked at the group between 60 and 79 years of age, and then they looked at the group 80 to 95 years of age. But what they also did was break up these groups on the basis of how many years of education they'd had. So, for example, in this group of people between 16 and 59, some had only had 0 to 8 years of education, some had had between 9 to 12 years, and some had had between 13 to 21 years of education. What does education do to, what influence does that have on someone's verbal fluency? When people are between 16 and 59? And then have a look, what's people's verbal fluency like depending on the number of years they've had education when they're 60 to 79? And what happens when people are even older? Hopefully you've noticed that depending on someone's education, the more education they've got, the higher their verbal fluency. It's particularly marked as people get older. So for example, the people who are between 80 and 95, if they've only had 0 to 8 years of education, they can come up with about 22 words in total. But in the same age group, if they've had 13 to 21 years of education, they're coming up with almost double the number of words. So the important message here is that it's not just about people's age that makes a difference on their ability to think of words. Education has a huge influence as well. Why might that be important for you as a speech pathologist? What kind of questions would you need to ask someone who's an older adult? If you were going to do this test of verbal fluency and ask them to name words starting with F, A, and then S, and you were calculating their score, what else would you need to know about them before you could make a judgment about their verbal fluency? Okay. Thinking about language changes at a broader level, There's also been some work done to look at if there's changes that occur to people's ability to tell stories. So that's at a discourse level. And so there's a study done in 2016 that's had a look at this. And they compared 4 age groups, that 20 to 39s, 40 to 59-year-olds, 60 to 79-year-olds, and people over 80. And they compared their ability to tell stories on 3 different tasks. A picture description task, asking the person to tell them the story of Cinderella, and then a task asking them how to do something. And this is an American study, so they asked people to describe how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So are there any differences in typical older people's ability to tell stories? Well, let's have a look. So the first task is the broken window task. And basically what that involves is you say to the person, here are some pictures, here are 4 pictures that tell a story. I want you to have a look at these pictures and then tell me the story about what's happening. If we go back, oh, we can't go back. So remember, that's the first task. But the second task was to tell the Cinderella story, and the third task was to describe how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Were there any changes? Well, interestingly, the groups did seem to separate on some tasks, but not others. There was no difference between the groups on the picture description, the broken window task. Everyone did the same. There was no difference between the really young people and the older people on their ability to tell a story with the broken window pictures. But there were differences between these 2 age groups on the Cinderella task and the procedural discourse task. And in thinking about why those differences might have been, they thought about how different these tasks were. And if you think about it, the picture description task of the broken window is quite easy in that it's a very short story. In fact, there's only 8 main concepts in it. And also there are pictures to help the person tell the story. They don't have to remember so much about where they're up to in the story or what the story's about, because they've got the pictures there to help them. It's very different when you're trying to tell the Cinderella story. It's a much more complicated story. In fact, there are 34 key concepts in the Cinderella story. And there's no pictures to help you tell the story. You've got to remember where the whole narrative, you've got to remember where you're up to in the story. And it's a complicated story. And similarly with the procedural discourse task, even though there are only 10 main concepts, you haven't got any picture support. You've still got to draw on your own memory of how to make that sandwich to be able to explain it well. So that's made people think, well, is the problem actually, or not the problem, but is the change actually occurring in people's language, or actually is the change occurring in other cognitive abilities and like memory and attention and planning, things that people really need to draw on in task 2 and task 3. And is it changes in people's those cognitive abilities that is actually causing these changes in storytelling? So that really makes us think about the cognitive processes underlying language. even for thinking about the animal naming task and the verbal fluency task about the number of words you can think of starting with F, A or S, you still need some really intact cognitive abilities to do those tasks well. You need to keep your attention on the task. You need to remember the words you've said already so you don't repeat them, and you need to draw on your memory of your entire store of words. And in the storytelling tasks, you also need attention to the task. You can't get distracted. You need to remember where you're up to in the story, and you need to plan your story so that it makes sense and comes out in the right order. So really there are definitely, we see change, typical aging healthy adults, their language, especially at that verbal fluency and discourse level, there are definitely clear changes, but what's not so clear is whether the changes occurring at the language level or if the changes are actually happening with these cognitive abilities that we draw on to do the language tasks. To think about this some more, you might want to think about how to the impact of difficulties or impairments, if you like, or a loss of storytelling discourse ability at the impairment level, and how that might impact on everyday activities, life situations, environmental factors that might make it easier or harder, and personal factors that might influence a person's ability to tell stories as well. Okay, so to finish off, just to summarise that, what we've talked about in terms of typical ageing, we've talked about changes in language in terms of verbal fluency as well as storytelling abilities, also called discourse abilities. And we've talked about hearing in changes, which are the precursor to understanding speech. But in terms of the range of practice areas, there are minor changes with ageing across all areas of range of practice. For multimodal communication, there's age-related changes to vision, and as we discussed, hearing, that'll impact on people's ability to use different channels to communicate. We've talked about the significant changes that happen in language. There are also significant changes that happen in voice as we get older, that Jenny may have covered in her voice lecture. And there are minor changes in speech fluency and swallowing. But the main ones that really impact on communication generally are the hearing, the vision, which we haven't talked about, and the language. So what? I guess, does it really matter if there are minor changes to people's communication ability as they get older? Well, yes, it matters for two really important reasons, at least. The first one is you need to know whether the changes that you're seeing in someone's communication are typical of people that age and that education background. Because if it is typical of someone that age and background, then it suggests that there's nothing else going on. However, if the person's communication abilities are very different or much worse than you'd expect just from typical aging, then that suggests that there might be something else that is an issue that needs looking into. So that's the first issue. But the second issue is that there does appear to be consequences for older people in the way that they're perceived by others. And this is nicely captured by the communication accommodation theory. So if you imagine if we were talking to each other in a room together at the same time, let's say I'm speaker 1 and you'd be speaker 2. I might say something to you. So speaker 1 explains something. Okay, here we are. And you might look at me and you might have a confused look on your face and you're signaling to me that you don't understand what I've said. So I would recognize that here and hopefully I'd rephrase it, say it a bit differently, and then you'd signal to me that you do understand. And I'd feel good about that because we'd resolved the difficulty and we could continue on. So what we're doing in everyday interaction is that we're making accommodations for each other. I'm saying something, I'm checking if the message was successful, and if I get a message that it hasn't worked, I'll accommodate my message. And then you might say something to me, I'll indicate that I don't quite understand, you'll change your message, you'll accommodate me and help me understand a different way. And that is typical. The way we typically interact, all of us, is that we're constantly checking, constantly accommodating for each other. But researchers who are interested in communication and aging noticed, Bouchard and colleagues noticed that something sort of sinister can happen when people are talking to older people. And they call it the communication predicament model. So let's talk about what happens here. Is what we see is that, let's say, a young person, let's say you, encounters an older person. And what you might see in that older person is old age cues. And what they are is you might notice that the person is wearing a hearing aid. They might have glasses, they might have grey hair, all these signals that tell you that this person is older. In the communication predicament model, what these researchers say happens is that what young one does is starts to over-accommodate and starts to make stereotyped expectations of the older person. For example, they might see the hearing aid, look at the glasses, see the grey hair and think, oh, this person's really old, they're really deaf, they probably can't remember anything. Oh God, if I ask them to tell a story, they'll go on, or they won't be able to do it. And so they start to interact with the older person in a kind of condescending way. They might, for example, the person might lean in, speak loudly, and use sort of condescending kind of language like sweetie or dearie or love. The problem with that is that the older person recognises how they're being talked to. They recognise that the younger one sees them as deaf, stupid, and deserving of this sort of condescending, diminutive talk. It's going to make the older person, it constrains their opportunities for conversation with this person, and it can result in a loss of self-esteem, because the message you're really getting from this other person is that you're old and you're incompetent. So this is the message that people get: I must be incompetent. If you feel like that, you're going to express more old age cues, and this cycle gets worse. This is a really important model for us to think about as healthcare providers, because lots of us will be working with older people, and we certainly don't want to be interacting with them in a way that creates this cycle of interacting that makes them feel less competent, less able. It's not what we're in the business for. So what can we do about it? Well, they give us the alternative, which is the communication enhancement model. So what's this about? This is about when young one encounters older two, and the young one sees the signs of aging. They might see the hearing aid, the glasses, the grey hair. But in the communication enhancement model, what the young one does is they don't over-accommodate. They don't make these gross generalizations and assumptions about the person's abilities. They just tailor their communication to the one thing or the two things that the person needs support with. So here, if the person sees hearing aids, if young one sees that the older person is wearing hearing aids, they might make sure that they face the older person. They might make sure that the light's good so that the older person can see their face. And that would be all that would be needed. They wouldn't change their tone of voice, they wouldn't change the topics of conversation, they wouldn't use condescending language, and then as a consequence what happens is the older person recognises how they're seen, and they recognise they're being treated as an adult. It enhances their sense of respect. That is a person that they'd want to communicate more with, so you can have more opportunities for conversation, and it generally enhances people's self-esteem. Basically, the message you give people, older people, is you count, you're competent, which enhances so that really the idea is that the communication experience is an enhancing experience for the older person rather than one that diminishes them. Okay, so that's really it in summary. So what we've talked about is those key concepts of communication, language, and speech. We talked about two main changes that are typical of communication changes in aging. We focused on hearing and language changes. And then we thought about the implications of these changes for how we interact with older people, with hopefully a really strong message that how we interact with people who are older can really, like all of us, how people interact with us makes a huge difference to how we feel about ourselves and how we think we're seen by others. And that as healthcare providers, you've got a real responsibility to make sure that the way that you interact with an older person supports them to communicate well, but also communicates a message to them that they are competent and able. That's really the key message for the talk. Thanks for watching.